Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Layers Licensing and Games podcast. My name is Mitch, and joined once again by our co-founder and CEO, Ratchet. Hello, Ratchet.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing well. Back in Europe, jet lagged. I got off a 25-hour flight on Monday afternoon, and I woke up at 3 a.m. this morning and was wide awake. Haven't been back to bed, so we're getting through it.
I think a lot of people don't realize how far Australia really is. So, prepare yourself in case you're going to go on holiday there.
Oof. So that's the two 12-hour flights, right? It's an epic journey, at least.
14 and a half hours to Dubai and then 8 hours to Lisbon. Yeah. So, the second one feels like just a quick jaunt across Europe compared to the first one. So it's not too bad. And pleased to be speaking with you today, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
No, pleasure to be here. Great. Excited to talk about IP and other things with both of you. And of course, jet lag.
Yeah. Well, just for a quick intro, today we are joined by Bob Slinn, who is the VP of Biz Dev at FunPlus, probably best known for your 4X zombie survival game, State of Survival, among others. You're based in FunPlus's Zurich office, or as we just found out, you're actually based in a small town outside of Zurich. Yeah. What's the name again?
It's called Zug, Z-U-G. So it's funny. I mean, we say the greater Zurich area so it's even loosely connected, but yeah, it's close enough.
The greater Zurich area. Okay, cool.
The Swiss would probably disagree because it's in another canton, so when there's fierce cantonal rivalry, but we'll call it greater Zurich to make it easy.
Okay, cool. Well, coming to you from FunPlus's farmhouse in Zug,
exactly.
Bob.
The cows are outside.
Yeah. Bob's responsible for leading the company's Western market strategic biz dev efforts. Previously was in Facebook's game partnerships team. Don't hold that against him. And we was also in EA's publishing team for Pogo.com. So really excited to be speaking with you today, Bob.
I know, great to be here, as mentioned. Excited to chat with you both.
Cool. Well, first of all, tell us about what you're doing at FunPlus. I think you've been there for almost 2 years now, and seems like in that time, on the topic of IP partnerships, you're doing a lot more in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it has been just about 2 years, which continues to surprise me. It's the old saying, time flies. But so essentially, what we're doing and what I'm doing is, we're based in the headquarters here. A big part of our company's success has been building our own original IP and original games. You mentioned State of Survival. We have two other big 4X strategy games, Guns of Glory and King of Avalon. And again, very much focused originally on building our own IP, our own worlds, our own universes. And strategy games tend to be pretty deep with deep storylines and character development and heroes and all these other things. But a couple of years ago, actually just around the same time as I was joining, we wanted to take a slightly different approach and effectively add another element to the games. And so there was a discussion around how could we add IP and what kind of IP would be relevant and what would the impact be and what were the goals around it. So essentially, again, it was completely new for us. And we started, the first one we did was with The Walking Dead, and had Daryl Dixon join the game as a hero. And then there was a whole other storyline built around him and his progress and involvement in the game. And then we followed that not too long after with integrating the Joker from DC Comics fame into State of Survival as well. And again, we really thought a lot about what would the right kind of IP be, what would the right character be, and then equally importantly, how would we integrate it into the game? And so it's been a pretty interesting learning process, I would say. And I think so far so good. Like we've learned a lot, but I think we've been really pleasantly surprised, or the characters have been well received by our players and our community. That was honestly the first filter, which was looking at what did the players want. And even, Walking Dead came out of a survey we did with our player base. We basically said, which characters or which heroes or which people would you love to see in the game? And Walking Dead was the number one. So that's again how it all started, and we kind of have built on it from there.
Super interesting. Like what led that initial kind of concept of we should look at IP? I mean, I think it's really interesting that you got to that point of surveying and understanding which IP, but like how did you even start that discussion in the first place around like we want to look at this space in general?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, right? Because particularly for a company like ours who focus so much on building our own IP, and that really is and continues to be a core part of our strategy is building these worlds. And we actually believe over time, and we're seeing it come true now, that the next generation of great IP will come from games and will be born in games. And you're seeing it across the board with everything from Arcane to even Plarium launching a new series off the bat attached to Raid. So definitely, we do feel that this is next generation. But I think what we were looking at, and as everyone knows, in mobile gaming, super competitive space, user acquisition is incredibly competitive. And so we were looking at different approaches there. But I think we were also looking at the way our games evolve. We add new heroes on a regular basis, and heroes are a core part of the game. And the players are heavily invested in the heroes they have, and there's a whole process of unlocking them. And we were looking again at ways we could expand the storyline and expand the selection of heroes. And we're regularly in communication with our players. And so there was sort of this thought process around, okay, well, if we were going to introduce something new to the game, a different theme, what could it be? And I think, again, IP was sort of, it's a natural extension. A lot of developers have done it, and a lot of developers have seen real success with it. Obviously, as you guys know, you live this all the time. It has to be done intelligently and carefully. So I think that's why when we first started thinking IP could provide both value from a marketing standpoint for new players and expand the audience. But I think for us, equally importantly, it was another way to engage our core player base and another way to drive engagement and ultimately monetization by introducing this whole new storyline and a new hero to the game.
And has it worked for both of those elements? I guess. I mean, like, firstly in the UA space, like, given how challenging it is, like, do you still believe that IP is something that can bring down UA costs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair question. A good question. I think both of these integrations happen pre IDFA and the ATT changes. So I think that reference point has changed pretty significantly around, how does UA work and how can IP influence that? I guess I'd say from our specific experience, we probably got more value and we probably did a better job, being super honest, of integrating the IP for the existing players. And we saw, I guess I said, a really positive response, really high levels of engagement. I'll have to dig out the percentage, but we saw a very significant percentage of active players who unlocked the hero in both cases for Daryl Dixon and for the Joker. So there's super high engagement. Players both unlock the hero and then use the hero. And for the Joker in particular, second time around, we built this very involved storyline because, The Walking Dead, pretty obvious integration, zombie game, post-apocalyptic, fine. Joker, not as obvious a fit. And so we built the writers built this very involved storyline of, is the Joker a hero? Is he a baddie? How does he play? And so there's this whole story unfolded over a period of 3 months where, of course, surprise, surprise, he was a baddie in the end. But, that story actually worked. And so the players really engaged with it. But that could have gone wrong if we just kind of thrown the Joker in without any context. To ultimately, but on your question about UA, I'll be honest, I think we probably underexploited the potential of IP just because I think we hadn't had the experience of thinking about how do you adapt your UA campaigns. Because FunPlus has been very specialized at real, I'd say, kind of hardcore performance, CPI, LTV equations, really, really good at performance marketing. And I think IP in some cases necessitates a slightly different approach and maybe a broader approach to marketing to really leverage the IP to its fullest. And I'd say we did some, but I'd say we could have probably done more. And I think because we were focused on the kind of existing formula and systems that worked, we did do some work with Daryl Dixon in particular, and we actually created this amazing TV spot. And we actually got Norman Reedus, and we did this whole shoot in LA, and all the stuff we'd never done before. But I don't think we necessarily knew what to do with the TV commercial. Like, we won a Clio for this thing. It's this amazing TV spot. It's on YouTube. You can see it, but we didn't necessarily run. We probably could have done more with the actual TV campaigns. But again, it's a whole different media strategy, and we're still learning about that. So I think from our experience, there's more to do. I guess I'd say moving forward to kind of present day and the world we all live in now for mobile gaming, where we know less about players and the old formulas don't necessarily work anymore. I think IP is even more important. And I think FunPlus, along with most mobile developers who have games of a certain size, are having to I'd say, relearn marketing in a lot of ways. Performance marketing alone is no longer, I think, sufficient to scale your game. You need to really think about different ways to both engage the community, work with influencers, work with even more traditional brand marketing. And we're at the beginning of that process and that journey. But I think if you really, this idea of a full marketing mix is, I think, going to be a necessity for developers to be successful. And you can see very easily how IP helps differentiate. And as you start to tell stories and build brands and use different types of marketing, IP becomes, I'd say, even more important in that mix.
Yeah, really, really interesting that you were also able to find that that collaboration really helped on the back end of the kind of engagement and retention and activation of kind of the existing audience. Because I guess you have players that are not just there for flash in the pan. They're around. They're playing for a while. So it makes sense to give them content that they genuinely love and they can interact with. So curious to hear it. I mean, it's exciting to hear that you were able to kind of tap into it for more than just the UA. I think UA is definitely one of the first things a lot of developers and publishers we speak to, think about as kind of the primary driver of primary reason to use IP. But the fact that you're able to then see that advantage later on down the funnel is really cool. Before we jump into more, I'm actually curious about the fact that you have so much experience across working with IP partners. A lot of people that we are working with don't have people like you in their team, right? And so I'm curious, like, how much of your role is focused on IP and building that pipeline of working with more IP, and was that something you'd done at Facebook and other jobs before, or was IP something that you kind of leapt into with this role at FunPlus, and now it's kind of growing? Like, what's that been like?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a good question. I'd say I spend a good chunk of my time. Actually, my one team member, Josh, is based in California, and so he ends up managing a lot of the direct relationships now, just because it's easier. A lot of the IP holders, or at least certainly Western IP holders, are based in California, so that works well. And we have, subsequent to doing these first two, we did kind of a round of visits with a lot of the usual suspects and talked to them and understood how they operated them. As you guys know, the different IP holders operate very differently, and some are very happy to license their IP to, in some ways, all comers if the commercials work. Others are very, very protective of the IP and want to make sure that the storyline is perfectly integrated and that it supports the brand. And so we have kind of talked to a pretty broad range, and we're actually in the process of doing another integration that'll hopefully go live sometime towards the end of the year in State of Survival. So more to come. But one of the challenges, again, is to the point I was making about marketing, is really thinking about how can we use IP to broaden the appeal and find new audiences and bring them into the game. So we'll see if it works. But there's another one in discussion now. To the point about
Cool.
having done this before. I mean, it's funny. I hadn't done IP in the traditional, like in this sense of really going in, traditional licensing. We did do a bunch of things at Facebook when we were launching an HTML5 gaming platform, where we were launching a brand new thing. And again, IP is a great way to tell people you're doing something new. So I did do a trip to Japan where I went and saw every traditional video game maker, and we did Pac-Man and Space Invaders, and showing my age, all the games that I played when I was young in actual video game arcades. So yeah, that was the early taste of IP. And then way back in time at EA, I worked at Pogo, and a big part of Pogo's game library, it was a basic casual game service with all the Hasbro titles. And EA had a very, very big strategic deal with Hasbro. So that was probably my first real interaction with IP, because there was, again, multifaceted deal with Hasbro, and we spent a lot of time working with them. And again, they're sort of one of the, let's say, certainly one of the original IP licensors, and have built an enormous business off the back of that. So yeah, so that was my first experience. And then the trip to Japan, I will live long in the memory for 20-person meetings and trying to demo HTML5 games on a shaky connection to 20 skeptical Japanese game producers wondering what in the world Facebook's doing in their office and why they want Pac-Man. But again, it worked in the end. We were able to kind of Pac-Man was the big launch game. But yeah, no, again, it's all of these is, as you guys know, it's such an interesting challenge figuring out and matching the IP to the need you have and the audience you're trying to reach. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges and the hardest things to get right is finding that the right IP for the job, I'd say, or the right IP for your specific goals. And again, I think that plus the integration and the thoughtfulness around the process is what makes it either successful or not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How does that differ, like working with one licensor, like working with Hasbro at Pogo to like trying to find multiple licenses? Like it's obviously a different approach.
Yeah, very much a different approach. And I think what we've seen is, good news, bad news is for, I'd say, games today, there's a reasonably standard playbook for licensing IP and IP integrations. I mean, there's a lot of it happening. So I think that's the good news is that the commercials are reasonably well established and the model is reasonably well established. And I think, as I said, it becomes more a question of finding the right IP. And I think most, as I said, the majority, like the bigger holders of IP are reasonably, again, I think reasonably open to licensing because it's a core part of their business. I think where it gets more interesting is when you're trying to find and source IP where people don't normally license it. There are sort of, again, a lot of these discussions where the collaboration and the fit would be amazing, but company A may not necessarily be in the business of licensing their IP, and they're very protective of it. So I think that's where it gets harder. There are certainly some of the much more established businesses like a Hasbro where the model is pretty clear, and if there's a space in a category, then it just becomes a question of it's not as simple as working out the details, but again, there is an established model and precedents that you can follow.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's a lot of that is kind of like templated, whereas when you're going out and building these partnerships, you have to do it all from scratch. So it's something that I think we come across it is a challenge to know, like, what's the right price to offer? Like, how do you work through approvals? Like all of these things are, there's some sort of playbook, but people aren't really sharing their playbook across the industry all of the time. So
yeah,
definitely challenging.
No, and I can see you play a very useful role in that and trying to create some sort of transparency around the process. And again, where there is consistency and learnings of anything, you see very, very different approaches, even looking at the two big comic IP holders, Marvel and DC. They have a very different approach in terms of both how they license the IP, but also in terms of how you can use the IP. In Marvel, the characters have to very much look like the characters. There's a very clear playbook, whereas DC is interestingly quite open to you interpreting the characters. So, for example, with the Joker, we're licensing the comic book Joker, but again, if you rewind in time, there's multiple variants of the Joker that look quite different depending on which artist originally drew the Joker. So they're quite open to you finding your own version of the character, which is quite interesting. Because in a way, there is a FunPlus Joker now that exists that has never been seen before and looks slightly different, as long as you follow, again, the right guidelines and it looks like a Joker. So there's some pretty interesting nuances as you get into partnering with different people and how you can make the IP your own or how you can integrate it intelligently. So it's a lot of fun. But again, I think what the service you're starting to provide and you're scaling is super helpful because, again, it's I don't want to say it's dark art, but it's certainly not something that gets communicated a lot.
It's like the UA dark arts, the licensing dark arts. But the Joker is like it's really cool because I haven't played State of Survival, but if you look at the integration you did, it really is kind of like your own Joker, and I think it's an interesting approach what DC is doing because you can kind of add to the canon, right? And if you think of like games becoming, like cross media is a term you hear all the time. It's like you really then, if the game becomes big enough, you get this like new version of a character that has existed in various forms. So I think it's a really cool approach, as opposed to just like, here's the character out of the box. I mean, both have their merits, but yeah, it's interesting.
No, and I think the next part of that is where you start to see, Star Wars or other big IP where there's such a deep universe and there's so many elements of that in sub worlds and extensions and characters that you also start to see, I think, more and more this idea where with the right partnership, a game in particular, because it's interactive, because it's constantly evolving in a free-to-play game as a service model, you start to see IP that can live within a game over a period of time and actually start to extend the story and add new elements to the story as long as it fits with the existing canon and doesn't conflict with other things. So I think that's the other thing that's going to be super interesting is as you see some of these partnerships, and particularly for some of the fully licensed games, the game can actually add to the value of the IP and add to the story and the lore around the IP itself, and in some cases even add new characters. So I think with the right kind of collaboration, you're going to see this interesting extension where there will of course be value for the licensor, but the actual rights holder will start to, hopefully, if it's done right, have value for that they get back beyond the commercial elements.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to talk about your approach to like what you've done so far, because it is a little unique compared to some of the other studios that we've spoken to. I guess a model we've seen when we're talking about in-game integrations is, start small, do a small collaboration, see what effect it has on in-game metrics or UA or whatever it is, whatever the thing we're testing is. And then we go bigger and bigger from there. And you've kind of done the opposite, where you've started with, Daryl Dixon, The Joker, Orlando Bloom.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, was your approach always to just go big, or like, how did that come about?
Yeah, no, it's I think, for us, particularly State of Survival, and when we started doing these, the game was already in a way so big. Like it really, it was a game that scaled up very quickly. And again, in a weird way, fortuitous timing, launched the game at the end of 2019 and happened to coincide with the period of time when people had a lot of time at home. And so the game grew very big, very quickly. And so I think by the time we started looking at IP, we needed something that would move the needle, for lack of a better expression. And I think with the scale of the game and the economics around the game, it kind of made sense to try to find something that would be would truly add value. And also, again, I think we were also guided by what our players were hoping to see. And I think what's nice is because it was a integration within the game over, Daryl Dixon was in the game for 6 months. Again, it's a bigger IP, but for us within the context of the game, it kind of made sense. It was the right size of experiment for the size of our game. And if it hadn't worked, the funny part is it's a 6-month integration, but Daryl Dixon is still in the game. If you have, if you would unlock the hero, you still can play with Daryl Dixon forever, just because of the virtue of the way the game works. So, thankfully it worked out, because it would have been awkward if it hadn't.
There's a lot of risk there, right? Like I'm assuming you spent a lot to get the rights, so you have to make sure that it pays off.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's again finding the right balance for the IP holder and the licensor, and we in this case I think it worked well. And their MC are a great partner to work with, and again I think they see the value of these extensions as well. In ways, it extends their universe, just like it provides value to our players.
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of like horses for courses then, right? Like if you had have had a smaller game, then maybe you would have considered a smaller IP to work with. But, in your case, you really needed something that I guess had like pretty broad marketing power as well, right?
Yeah, and again, when you're talking about a zombie game, there's only so many, so many types of IP you can bring to the game and make it work. That's the other thing. You can list the 5 to 10 IP that fits, would fit credibly in the story, right? And Walking Dead would be probably the first.
I know you can't give it away, but are you going off-piste for this next collaboration that you mentioned is coming out later in the year? Are we getting a Barbie collaboration? Is that where we're going?
Yeah, that would. I don't think it would work out very well for Barbie and State of Survival. She might have meet an untimely end. But no, we're looking at a couple of things. One of them would be, I would say, definitely off-piste. Certainly something you might not expect to see in the game. Again, because this challenge, and it's somewhat unique to strategy games in that the way the audience engages, there's such deep engagement, but the audience is reasonably narrow.
Yes.
And one of the challenges is continuing to bring people into the top of the funnel. And so IP, in this case, may serve to broaden the top of the funnel and introduce the game to a new audience. So by default, that might be a little surprising, but I'm confident.
Just for context, for like others to understand, like what does a player kind of roughly look like in terms of how long they're playing for or how often they're coming back? Like I don't know how much you can share there, but like as a guideline.
Yeah, no, I mean, but the way the retention curve tends to be that we lose a lot of people pretty early on, kind of the D1 to D7 numbers are reasonably low, but once people have gone through the sort of initial phase, and the way, the way the games tend to work is there's an initial solo phase where you're basically building your base, and we lose a lot of people there, whether it's a reasonable amount of work and investment. And then once you get and join an alliance, clan, in our case, they're called alliances, um, that the game changes dramatically in the sense it becomes very social. You get this deep engagement and level of commitment with your alliance. And there are different types of alliances. There's some that are ridiculously hardcore, where people are waking up at 2 a.m. to organize battles and raids. And I've
Oh
joined.
man, I could have been on State of Survival this morning in my jet lag case.
I'll tell you, if next time you're doing this, if you want to join an alliance, I joined multiple alliances because when I was interviewing, I started playing the game and I got sucked in completely. And then I joined one alliance, and once I actually started work, I just didn't have time to participate. So they very quickly kicked me out because I wasn't committed enough. And it was like dating. I tried another alliance that was still a little too involved, and the last one was like, okay, well, as long as you participate at some level, we're happy to have you. But yeah, I'd say that the pattern tends to be that the people who stay are very involved and will spend a lot of time, certainly multiple times a day and hours a day. Just because the core, the really compelling part of the game, which drives long-term retention, is this social element, both within your alliance, where there's a lot of trading resources and battle and preparation, and then you have these epic kind of wars, alliance against alliance and raids, and so those all happen real time. So it tends to require a pretty high level of commitment for those who are still there. So yeah, so it's pretty deep engagement. Hence why adding IP and introducing a new hero can be compelling, because we had to, it's interesting. For Daryl Dixon, we made it reasonably accessible, and it was quite easy to get the hero, which meant that all the core players unlocked it more or less instantly. But that meant in some ways it was less compelling because people didn't have to work as hard. Whereas the Joker, we changed the way the process worked to collect the assets around it, and it took longer. And I think actually it probably worked better in that sense, because it felt like more of a commitment, and the people felt there was more value around the character. And we tend to have these events and these different storylines that unfold as part of the unlock process.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm curious to jump into kind of like obviously you mentioned Daryl Dixon there, but on the flip, I'm interested in the Orlando Bloom collaboration. I think games are often generally licensing the fictional characters, not necessarily like talent or the actor behind it.
Yeah.
What made you do that, and how did that come about? Like it's quite different to what we've seen in market.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I think the original, we were starting to really started looking at from a marketing standpoint first, and thinking about how could we evolve marketing. We've had this discussion. King of Avalon is a game that's been around for 6+ years, and we've done a lot of marketing over a long period of time. So we needed to start doing something different. So the original discussions were around at a marketing level. I'm thinking about Orlando Bloom as a spokesperson, for lack of a better word, and really thinking about how could he help with marketing campaigns. And so the original discussion started with marketing and having him promote the game. And so interestingly, as the discussions moved forward, there was more and more interest in having some type of integration in the game. So it kind of was one of the things that happened organically. It was the initial discussions with his team were all around, hey, we're going to, can you do a marketing campaign to promote the game? Great. And then as discussions went forward, it became clear that there was interest in actually having him join the game and integrating the game. So it went kind of the other way around. It wasn't initially, to your point, there wasn't, we need to have Orlando Bloom himself in the game. It was more, there's a credible fit and a nice fit from a marketing standpoint. And then discussions evolved to the point where they go, actually, why don't we create a hero? And it's kind of a funny thing, because the hero is actually called Orlando Nightshard. So it's kind of a fictional character that's obviously him.
Based on.
And then, then the commercial is all, Knights of the Round Table, Arthurian era. So, he obviously has lots of credibility in that time. So there's a great commercial that sits with that character, and he's all dressed in his medieval armor. And so it started with marketing. and then morphed into this game integration. And again, it seems to work well. But yeah, there was a bit of a conceptual shift to move him from an actor promoting the game to an actual character. So even at this kind of hybrid, where it's obviously Orlando Bloom, but he's not called Orlando Bloom in the game.
Yeah, becomes part of the lore. Yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it does like organically, like it makes a lot, like I can see how that would evolve. And, you know, Orlando Bloom is quite famous for playing like fantasy characters, right? I don't imagine if you'd have done it with Mark Wahlberg, it would have had the same effect. Like,
exactly.
I think so it makes sense. It's an interesting collaboration and cool to hear how it kind of evolved. The one of the things I want to talk about is like working with big IPs and you know, how it's kind of fraught with risk as well. I mean, if you work with one of the big IPs and you make a really bad experience, then, you know, you're going to suffer reputationally. If you don't make an experience which is kind of true to your fan base, then, you know, you're going to suffer financially because no one's going to, you know, buy the or no one's going to engage with the collaboration. So how aware of like those risks were you when you started down this path with these big IPs, and I guess how did you manage them?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, it is really important. I mean, you think about those from the outset. So I think with the question of the fit, I mean, it wasn't really scientific. It was very much, again, as you said, it really all came out of this initial player survey. And even in subsequent discussions, we've been looking at that survey and talking to players and understanding what they wanted to see. So that in that way, there wasn't that much risk in the sense of Walking Dead we knew it would fit with and resonate with the audience. But to your broader point on the actual integration, I have to say, I mean, the team, we have a pretty big team of writers, and for the type of game that it is, there ends up being a lot of text, a lot of narrative, a lot of storyline as you work through. And we have these regular events that take place. And so there's always a branch to the story. And there's this whole thing about the scientists trying to find a cure. Like there's already a pretty involved story. So we had to think about how Daryl Dixon could fit into that story. So the good news was there was a lot of material to work with. The bad news was it had to be credible and there had to be a story that worked. And again, I think the Daryl Dixon thing was pretty natural. And again, just given the game, the way the game works, creating a hero was kind of the obvious thing to do. And I think, so we were in a way lucky that the game kind of had a template in a sense of the way the events work and the way the characters work that you could kind of logically see. We were already creating new heroes all the time. So you can in a way just say, okay, well, we're going to create a special hero. So the way our games are formatted made it, I think, an easier thing to structure. I think going to the Joker or the Orlando Bloom one, we had to be much more creative around how we built a special storyline to make it work. Because again, if you just put Orlando Bloom in the game, it would be, there would definitely be this moment of, a jar, and it would not necessarily resonate with the audience. You could get it wrong. Or the Joker is even probably a higher risk one in the sense that, why in the world is this DC character in the game? There's no Batman. What's he doing? But yeah, the storyline was the hardest part, I think. And then building events that, again, kind of mapped the Joker universe to the State of Survival universe. And that was, I think, the hardest part to mesh. And I think that's, again, for a deeper game like ours, it's easier because there's more material to work with. I think if you're looking at a casual game where it's primarily, like, say, traditional puzzle game, it's very difficult to fit IP into that because there isn't really much to actually integrate into. And that's, I think, where it becomes more challenging is if there is a deep storyline already, then it becomes easier. And I think that's one of the challenges, I think, for different types of games. And I think if we go forward, then finding that right balance. I mean, I think just like looking at a very current example, Subway Surfers have just launched their next game, Subway Surfers Blast, which is, again, a pretty standard, well-known, well-established puzzle mechanic. But I think what I was just playing on the train in, actually, so it's top of mind. But they've taken what is an incredibly iconic game-specific IP, and from what I can see, they basically constructed a nice meta that lives in that universe, and I
Mm-hmm.
suspect will take various elements from the runner game and build a storyline that makes sense around Jake, the main character. And so I think it can be done. It does require probably more work and more effort than um, might initially be perceived. And I think actually you made a good point. You can also IP can be relevant just from a marketing standpoint as an endorsement. Figuring out if you
Mm-hmm.
accept that it's just marketing and you're going to benefit from the audience awareness, then there can just be a brand fit, and that maybe is
Mm-hmm.
enough. I think for our purposes, for these longer term integrations, it has to really fit with the game.
Yeah, makes sense.
I mean, like there's substantially less meta in a merge game than there is in like a zombie survival game, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
makes sense. Just quickly, like talking about the managing the risk of staying true to your players. Um, the Joker, I think, is a really good example of that. How you've kind of started him off as a hero and then turned him into a villain, right? Like that's. I think if you'd have just tried to make the Joker a hero, it wouldn't really work the same way because people would be like, "Well, the Joker's like he's a mischievous villain, right?"
yes,
Like so,
yeah.
yeah. I think that's clever. It's a really staying true to the character.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, we also have been lucky with the partners we've worked with in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that for both for AMC and DC, they of course live and breathe these characters all the time, and there's a huge amount of knowledge and backstory and just real awareness, and we learned a huge amount from them throughout the process, and we had so many, we had obviously regular calls and approval process, and as we built out the characters in the storyline, we worked very closely with both partners respectively, and I lost count of the number of times DC would say, you know what, the Joker just wouldn't do that, or the Joker would do this, or this doesn't
Mm-hmm.
resonate. This isn't true to his character. Exactly, he's mischievous. This would, he would never use. So, again, I think that's another thing that we learned a lot is coming from a world where we'd always built our own IP and built our own storylines, and you're of course not constrained in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's positive and negative to having these constraints, and I think there is a huge amount of value that we were able to gain from partnering with
Mm-hmm.
Warner Brothers DC. They have this amazing knowledge of what the characters should do and what will resonate with their fans. So we evolved a lot based on their feedback, and that's again key to making it feel authentic and credible. Is that the Joker also has to feel like the Joker, right?
Yeah, having that opinionated partner that knows their lore and their fan base is
Yeah,
probably going to be helpful in reducing risk and making sure that things land well. So no, makes sense. I think on the flip side, you mentioned on the player base side, I think it was the surveys that kind of made that initial Walking Dead collaboration kind of come to mind and make sense. And I guess for that you need to have players in the first instance. So like that leans into obviously content integrations and collaborations on existing games. Is that something that you'll continue to only work in that way, or do you think like there's obviously publishers that like Scopely working with IP based games and licensing games for licensing IP for new games? Like, is that approach that you think is just outside of FunPlus DNA, or is it completely different in how you approach it? Like, I'm curious on your view of using IP to build a new game around it.
yeah, no, and I think it's this is historically we had built our own IP, and we are though. Looking at the idea of fully licensed games, and it's a completely
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
different challenge. To your point, you're making a much bigger bet on the IP, and finding it. But again, I think in some ways the risks are higher, the complexity is infinitely higher. But the same question in our case remains: what IP could we apply to strategy in this case? And so there's some things that hopefully you'll see in the not too distant future, where again we are marrying an IP with an entire game experience, and that again, risks are higher, but hopefully the upside is higher. And again, in this new environment where marketing is harder, um, having a full IP experience will hopefully be beneficial.
Cool. That's very cool. Nice to get the inside scoop. Obviously, don't know what it is, but looking forward to seeing whatever you're planning in that space. I
Yeah,
think it's um, I think it makes sense, especially like if you've seen the value of IP within games, then I think it's easier to probably justify and take on that risk to potentially land with something bigger that's strong out of the gates, and you can appeal to that audience. So, makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Yeah, and again, I think the same challenge applies. So it's the process of both picking, in our case, an IP that would match with the strategy genre, and then
Totally.
also all the integration work. And uh, it's it's certainly not an easy thing. I mean, there's incredible successes and also games that just didn't work because again that marriage wasn't credible or wasn't properly executed. It's but I do think overall, I mean, IP will continue to grow in importance. I think just as again as gaming evolves and as marketing evolves, I think the need to differentiate and the need to have some sort of recognizable brand, I think that's going to become more important. You're going to have the established IPs integrating the gaming, and then of course new IP coming from gaming going to other forms of media.
I think the constraint you mentioned is also really, really healthy. Like you know your strategy players, right, from what you've done to date, and so it's easy at least to look at the world of IP and figure out like what can work here, what will work for this type of player. You know, they're looking for something that'll engage them. We can build a world that actually works with the strategy genre and the meta. So like leaning into that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a good call out for any developers or publishers that are looking at like licensed games. At least, you know, if you can lean into what you know and the players that you know, it's easier to build games around that and make sure that, you know, it's IP that'll land in the category.
Yeah.
In terms of like what you've done to date, are you able to share anything around metrics and kind of, you know, what good looks like? Like, you know, if you're talking about a UA increase, or sorry, a decrease to cost, or you know, the kind of engagement or monetization lift that you're aiming for, like what does that look like, and are there any particular learnings there?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think what we were hoping on the UA side, without sharing metrics, was we were hoping to be able to, I'd say, expand the range of audience we targeted with UA rather than necessarily expecting it to be cheaper. We were hoping we could broaden the top of the funnel and get, you know, a broader mix of people engaging and converting. It kind of worked. I think part of it was, again, it's a different approach, and I think it required a lot of optimization, and we did some of that. I think we probably could have, in retrospect, gone further and really thinking about how could we further adapt our marketing and creative and messaging to really get full benefit from the IP and reach that audience. But I think for us, that was the primary metric. Looking at UA, it was less saying existing audience will convert more cheaply, as we can hopefully reach a broader audience than we would otherwise be able to do with our own IP and our own creative. So that's, I think, from the marketing standpoint. In terms of, you know, retention, we look a lot, obviously, at the, you know, the long-term engaged players, and we did see some positive trends in terms of level of engagement and in monetization. But it was, I think, again, the impact and the scale that the game's operating at, it was not dramatically positive. I think it was net positive, and I think it was more, we did see a lot of positive feedback, anecdotal feedback from players. They were excited to have something new in the game. And so I think at some level, it was the fact the community was positive and we saw lots of positive feedback was in some ways enough. And, you know, again, we did see some improvements in terms of longer term retention and monetization of that most engaged player base. But I think it was in some ways more important that the community saw it as a positive, and it was an event that was well received. Obviously, it'd be great if you saw these dramatic lifts, but you know, it's
wouldn't it just, we were waiting for like the soundbite where you'd be like, you know, and it was amazing, and we smashed all of our targets, and IP is the way to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is. I mean, look, I think what is clear is that from The Walking Dead to The Joker, we figured some things out, and again, we changed, as I was mentioning, effectively the unlock flow and the process of unlocking the character and the hero, and ironically making it harder to do made it more compelling and drove both higher engagement and higher monetization.
How much of that is a science versus an art, right? Like, you know, do you have benchmarks now that you set out when you do an IP collaboration to say, like, you know, we absolutely have to meet this benchmark for this to be successful? Or is it more, like you said, it's more kind of qualitative, where you look at it and say, what did the community say about the integration?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously wanted to make sense from a financial standpoint and to see positive metrics. I don't think we necessarily have a benchmark because, again, I think looking at what we're trying to do now, I'd say there's probably going to be an even heavier emphasis on this idea of broadening the audience appeal. Whereas I think particularly The Walking Dead was much more appealing to the core audience who are already in the game, with the kind of the UA element of the marketing element as second priority. Whereas I think now, given the stage the game's at and the maturity of the game and the evolution of marketing, I think we'll lean more into that first element. And so I think that'll become a more critical metric, which is, can we really broaden the funnel? Can we bring new people into the game and convert them?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think you've definitely figured it out, like within your space and your game as well. I'm curious if you have a view on market and genres in general for IP. Like, do you think IP works better for some genres and categories? And are there places where you think it doesn't make sense? And like, what makes collaboration successful? What is something that you'd avoid, I guess, as kind of final notes for anyone listening?
For sure. No, it's look, I think again that the range of IP is so broad. I mean, I think you look at things where, in a way, the ultimate IP collaboration would have been EA FIFA, right? That's no longer the case. But if you think of truly taking, making it away, FIFA became a global brand as a result of that. But you look at the credibility that provided and the success. There's examples like that where there's a very natural fit and clear value add from bringing IP or characters into a game, and then you go kind of more and more towards the fictional realm, and you Star Wars and Harry Potter, and I think I think a couple of the keys. One is matching the IP to the type of game. So I think if you're looking for these deeper, more immersive, mid-core and beyond types of games, you need IP that has that depth of story and the depth of character and the lore, because otherwise you're just going to run out of you can only go so far, and you can't match the depth of the game and the engagement to the depth of the IP. So that's why you look at the recent Harry Potter game, you look at some of the more successful Star Wars games, they're able to build this long, continuing, evolving storyline because there's so much content and so many heroes to unlock. And I think that's where, if we are to do an IP licensed game, we'll need to have something that has this broad universe of characters that you can pull from. Whereas I think if you're looking at something that's much more of a casual experience or more mass market, then again, matching the IP to that audience works. And I think, unfortunately, you look at something like there's some games where it hasn't worked because the gap is too big. But I think, again, if you can find an IP that's broadly accessible, and that can fit nicely with a casual game, and it still has to work, though. It still has to feel authentic. And I think that's always the balance, right? Is finding something that matches your type of game and your audience, but also where you can be credible and create some sort of authentic experience. Because, as I think we've all seen, there are games where they've more or less tacked on the IP, and it works okay in initial marketing, but then the initial conversion is fine, but the retention is terrible. So the integration is unfortunately largely wasted. So I think that's it's all about authenticity and all about matching the type of IP and the audience that attracts to the type of game you're trying to build.
Yeah, I think we've heard it before, and I think it's nice to hear it again, that thematic and audience fit is, really very, very important, and then actually being able to work with the IP and support it in a way that the integration feels real and caters for the audience that's coming in because of the IP as well, not only to yours. So that's really helpful. I think we're coming up on time. Mitch, anything on your end you want to ask before we wrap up?
I do have one final question, a really important question. Will the players of State of Survival ever get the cure? You mentioned the scientist who's working on the cure. Is it ever coming? It's like The Walking Dead. Is there ever going to be a cure?
They're going to be a happy ending? I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't feel very optimistic for the souls in the game. I think they're going to have to suffer for a while longer. Unfortunately, it doesn't. It's such a funny thing with that the story continues to evolve, and there's always hope, but it's I don't think the cure is imminent.
When you finally do wrap up
Yeah.
State of Survival, I think it'd be a nice touch to just be like, you're all it's cured.
It's okay.
You know,
You can go back to
we're
normal
good.
lives.
Yeah. Cool. No, well, thanks for coming on, Bob. That was really interesting to hear how you're approaching things at FunPlus, and thanks for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both. Take care.
Thanks for watching the Licensing and Games video series. For more content like this, subscribe to our channel or check us out at layerlicensing.com.